Hello and welcome back to The Path, podcast from Lifestyle RX. I'm joined as always by Brendan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well.
Excellent. Okay, so this week we have another episode of Your Questions. So it's been a few weeks since we did this, and we like to make sure we get caught up on all the questions that you ask. So we've gone through the community and all the other places where the podcast is, and we've collected a bunch of questions. So I'm going to ask them, and Brendan's going to try and answer them. So we'll see how this goes. So as always, if you have a question that you want us to answer in a future episode, leave it in the post on the community for the episode or on YouTube, Facebook, wherever you're watching, in the comments, and we will go through them. All right, so should we jump in?
Sounds good.
Okay, so first question is, I completed the 12-week program in June of the past year. I made good progress and was happy with the improvements in my blood sugar numbers and my weight. I was close to reaching my weight goal, but it seems like I am stuck since. I've heard that this can happen, but it seems like this has been going on for too long. I've actually gained 2 pounds since the completion of the program, but that might not be significant. What do you suggest in that kind of situation?
So first thing is plateaus are normal, right? And the way to think about a plateau is just it's your body resisting further weight loss. And throughout all of evolution, when humans would lose weight, it usually was a bad thing, right? It usually was either there's not enough food or something was going on that was causing you to lose weight. So the body is very well designed to start to resist that in a certain number of ways. So what you see happen is your brain can turn down the metabolic rate. So the amount of energy that you're burning at rest can go down by about 30 or 40%, depending on kind of, if it's trying to resist that weight loss. So we generally will see people never, lose weight in a purely linear fashion. They'll lose weight for a while and then they'll plateau. And how long that plateau goes on is anyone's guess. We just don't have any kind of way of telling you whether it's going to break through quickly or not. I think the most important thing when you hit a plateau is, one, to know it's normal and not kind of like get frustrated with it. 2, I think you do want to kind of look and say, okay, am I doing all the things that got, that led to success in the first place? Or have I relaxed a little bit? Sometimes people will plateau because they've actually relaxed a little bit. And, kind of like we say better, not perfect, but they're actually stepping backwards a little bit on a few things. So it's always kind of worth looking at that. But a lot of people will be doing everything exactly the same way as they were before, and they kind of hit the plateau. And so I kind of just look at it from the standpoint of, the whole idea of the path is it's the set of things that you're doing consistently. And so just keep doing those things consistently, and you will break through on the other side of that. Now, most of the time, what you're seeing with a plateau is in what people kind of get frustrated about is weight, because and obviously we use weight we use it as a goal, right? So we set a target for it, to be really clear, it's an outcome goal, and outcome goals are really helpful in terms of setting direction. So the goal we're setting for a lot of people is 15% weight loss, which we know if they lose 15%, they'll generally get rid of most of the fat on the liver. So it'll kind of get them below their personal fat threshold and get them below that weight level. So it sets a direction of where we're going to go. We know we're making progress against that. But it's not that useful day to day because you can't control it, right? Like you really don't control your weight loss. What you do control are all the process elements, right? So the fasting. So if you're doing a 16-hour fast, you control that. If you're getting your protein with every meal, you control that. If you're getting the fiber with every day, you control that. The minutes of exercise, you control that. The hours of sleep, you control that. So I think, having an outcome goal is helpful for setting direction, but day to day, we should be really just kind of concerned, am I hitting all my process goals, right? I'm in the range and I'm doing all the right things. eventually we'll if we're doing all the right things, we'll eventually hit that outcome goal. But we often can't kind of predict from a timing perspective when we'll hit it. So I think, long answer. This is pretty normal. The biggest thing not to do is get frustrated and change kind of what you've been doing, right?
Yeah.
Because it's worked to date. You're just running into normal physiology. If you stick with it over time, it'll get better. There are other things that happen besides weight, though, right? And this is kind of a really important thing to make note of. So if you think about personal fat threshold for a second, we kind of have this concept of there's kind of a healthy zone for fat and then there's unhealthy zone for fat.
Yeah.
When we lose weight, we're losing weight from both buckets, right? And so what happens is you start to get room in your healthy fat zone, but you still have some fat in the unhealthy zone. And you can stay at the same weight, but redistribute that fat. And that's kind of an interesting thing. So when we practiced at Wellness Garage with the DEXA scanner, we would see that all the time. People would often lose a bunch of weight, plateau, but we'd have DEXAs during their plateau. And you would see that, oh, well, that was interesting. Your weight and body fat, for that matter, was staying the same, but the distribution of it changed. And so what was happening was you created some room in the personal fat threshold, but you had to catch up to move the fat from the visceral zone into that healthy zone. And I think that's really where, as you go along with the program and as you increase your exercise, exercise, whenever you're doing aerobic exercise, you're burning fat, and you're more likely to pull some fat from the visceral area to use during exercise. And then later that day, you might replace that fat when you eat. You might actually store a bit of fat, but you're likely to store it in the healthy zone. And so in a way, you're kind of flushing that visceral fat out. So, for those people that are in the plateau, just start visualizing this is probably something that's going on underneath the covers. The other thing is all of these, changes with kind of the right foods and the exercise and getting better sleep and managing stress, is all going to have other physiological changes that you don't necessarily see on the weigh scale. So just don't give it power over you to discourage you. Just stick with it. You will be, if you're doing all the right things, you will be getting better anyways. And at some point you'll break through that plateau.
Awesome, for sure. Okay, the next question. This person says, I'm curious about calories. How much is good and bad? And I've seen that people, are keeping track of their calories, calorie deficits, this type of stuff. What's the deal with calories and keeping track of them? What should you be thinking about?
Yeah, so calories, it kind of a fascinating whole concept and how it gets used, right? So people like to say that, losing weight is as simple as calories in equals calories out. And at one level, of course, that's true. At one level, the calories represent the energy in the food. And so if we truly knew how much energy we were drawing from that food, and we truly knew how much energy we're using, burning, then that's true. But what we know is different. we don't actually know that, right? Like we're not in we're not in a metabolic chamber where we can measure that, right? So what we know is we know kind of the foods that we're eating. We know how many calories are sort of in them. We don't, unless we're weighing it, we might not be very accurate. We don't really know how much we're absorbing, right? Because we don't absorb all of it. We don't really know how much energy it takes to absorb that food, right? And then and especially if we're eating whole foods, right? If we're eating whole foods, it's actually very hard to count calories properly. Ironically, it's easier with kind of processed foods because
there's an exact number on it, right? But
there's a number there. So anyways, on kind of keeping track of what's coming in, it's imperfect at best. it's even worse on the calorie expenditure side, because if you
Mhm.
think about it, the amount of calories you use, there's a certain amount, there's a thermic energy of food, so how much energy it takes to kind of get the food in. So we don't have a great idea about that, but it's it'll often be in the area of 5 to 10%.
Mm.
Then we have kind of our base metabolic rate, kind of just the energy that it takes to kind of be at rest. And so that we can kind of estimate from our lean muscle mass, or we can estimate it from our weight, but again, not super accurate unless you measure it.
Yeah.
Um, but we can approximate it. And then we have our activity. And we think, oh, if we add all those things up, that tells us how much we're burning. Not really, because our metabolic rate can move all around. And
Mm.
if we do a lot of exercise in a given day, our metabolic rate goes down. The amount of energy that it takes to run the body goes down. We actually turn down certain things because we're spending so much energy exercising.
Yeah. Interesting.
And that's something that we've seen in there's a book called Burn about this, but it's kind of constrained energy. It's in the community. I did a little review on this, but bottom line is you can't just add up all the things that you do during the day and think that you actually burn those calories.
Yeah.
So, and then you get the factor that we kind of alluded to in the first part of the first question, which is your brain has a whole bunch of levers here. And
Mm.
so one of the things that your brain will do is, as it starts to detect that you're losing weight, it'll start to kind of turn down the base metabolic rate. So again, that base metabolic rate starts to move. It'll do things like, normally we have something called NEAT, or non-exercise activity, and it's like fidgeting, right? Just how fidgety are you?
Yeah.
Um, if you're eating a lot of calories, you're more fidgety than when you're kind of fasting
Huh.
and not eating.
Huh.
Super dramatic when they do these kind of starvation experiments, right? Like people just stop moving,
Yeah.
and that ends up being a whole number of calories that get conserved that
Mm.
way. And then the final thing that your brain does is it tweaks the appetite, and so you think about that. Well, I don't feel like I'm any hungrier, but it's subconscious, and and the way I always like to think about it is like, when you go get your yogurt in the morning, why do you stop when you stop? Like when you're
Yeah.
scooping it in, right?
Yeah. Why don't you just
And
put the whole thing in there?
yeah,
Yeah.
like, most of us don't weigh our food, and and there's all these little opportunities to sneak a little bit more here, a little bit less there.
Yeah.
And that stuff's all subconscious, and it's just this little hidden drive. So the long and the short of it really is that you can't really count the calories that well. You certainly can't count how many calories you're burning. So the deficit that you're calculating is imperfect at
Mhm.
best. You're going to know you're running a deficit if you're losing weight, right? And so the scale is ultimately going to tell you. Um, and then so that's kind of the whole practical part, and then there's the notion of, well, a calorie is just a calorie. And so
Mhm.
Coca-Cola was a big sponsor of a whole kind of information campaign about a calorie being a calorie. And it just, on its surface, it's absurd, right? Like,
Yeah.
a calorie from broccoli is really the same thing as a calorie from Coca-Cola? Like, no, right? Because you get different hormonal responses, right? So,
Mm.
you have something that's pure sugar, you're going to get a massive insulin response. Well, what does insulin do? It stores energy, right? So,
Yeah.
everything else that comes in with that's going to get stored. You know, broccoli comes in with a whole bunch of micronutrients and fiber and things like that. It's going to have a very different response. Your body's going to respond to it very differently.
Mhm.
So, big long question around counting calories. I don't think it makes any sense to count calories kind of over a long period of time. Where it does make sense is sometimes when you're looking and you think you're doing everything right, and you've jumped into our program and you've made all these changes, and you really aren't losing weight, and you it's not like you had some success and plateaued, but you're just not losing weight.
Mhm.
um, but you feel like you're doing everything right, Or sometimes we'll even have people who do kind of everything right and they're gaining weight, right? And they're like, well, what's going on here? This, I was going to lose weight.
Yeah.
And sometimes there, what you'll find is if you do kind of the rough calorie count and you kind of look at your rough kind of basal metabolic rate, and you'll sometimes just see glaringly there's no deficit, because and there usually what it is there'll be some high density food that you're eating. And one particular case, we had a fellow who was eating 600 calories of nuts in the afternoon as his afternoon snack. And, it was, nothing wrong with the nuts,
Yeah.
but there's just a lot of extra energy there.
Yeah.
And kind of realized that he kind of realized that, he had salted nuts. So that was driving a little bit of craving. They tasted really good. And he wasn't really thinking about it. And it wasn't very hard to correct that with just some, raw almonds, kind of just a little handful. That was the snack. And then also the option of like, do I really need the snack? And just that little correction kind of allowed for him to actually get a calorie deficit and start to see the weight come off. So so long answer, I think the calorie counting is flawed. I think even more flawed is macro counting, because the macro counting kind of treats everything the same. Like, so you can make the claim that most protein is pretty similar in the sense that like proteins are going to have amino acids, and even if it's plant or animal protein, you're going to get most of the amino acids, and that's true, but we kind of like protein that comes with fiber, that or protein that comes with omega-3s. There's some better parts there. Fats certainly aren't all equal, right? There are fats that are really good for you. There are fats that we just get too much of and that aren't going to be helpful for you. And then when it comes to carbohydrates, we have a whole week on this in week 5. All carbohydrates are not created equally. You just simply cannot compare something with sugar in it to something like a chickpea and say that they're carb. So counting that as a category just is beyond me, right? Like, so so that becomes kind of what I find is really kind of the calorie counting. The only time to do it is when you want to spot check your diet to see if like, okay, am I really like something really off here? I'm missing something. Occasionally you'll find something that you just don't realize that it has quite as much energy density as you thought. And lo and behold, that's the reason why you're not losing weight, is you're just eating too much.
Sure. And that's something that like a dietitian would probably be a huge help with if you're wanting to spot check.
Exactly. And the dietitians are so good because they'll look, ask a few questions, then they'll usually zone in on exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
But but yeah, I think that's why we haven't built a calorie counter into the app, and nor will we.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay. So this next question here is about how often this person's wondering how often you should check your your blood glucose level. Like if you have like just a regular fingerprint prick glucometer and you don't want to wear a CGM all the time necessarily, how often should you be checking it, and what are you kind of checking for when you check it?
Right. So this one is definitely kind of, it depends, right? It depends on kind of what's happening with your diabetes. So if you're somebody who is on insulin because essentially you have a deficiency in the amount of insulin that you can produce, and you're taking extra insulin to make up for that, then you should be checking your blood sugars quite regularly during the day. And in fact, preferentially using a continuous glucose monitor so you can see the full pattern of it. You want full visibility. Because if you're taking insulin, first of all, you can get really good control because you can kind of take enough to make sure you get really good control. But you can get too good control. You can get low blood sugar. So you want to be sure that you're not going to run into that situation. If you're not on insulin, then, when we look at kind of checking your blood sugars, if you're on a sulfonylurea medication like glycoside or glyburide, you want to check your fasting sugars to see where you are in the morning. And if you're seeing sugars that are, especially as you make changes in this program, you're seeing sugars that are under 6, then you should talk to your doctor about reducing the dosage, because likely that will get lower as you go.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're not on either of those, but you're just on other diabetes medications, it's not that it's that necessary to check your blood sugars like multiple times during the day. Generally speaking, I like people to be checking their fasting blood sugar a few times a week. And then, what can be interesting is checking kind of what you are before a meal and what you are after a meal, and kind of seeing what happens, so you can kind of do a little bit, instead of wearing the CGM, you can kind of check your sugars of these. You just don't have to be obsessive about it, because you don't have the danger of a low one.
Yeah.
And you kind of want to just see that you're in range, right? And again, kind of, from the CGM episode where we talked about time and range, you can kind of use that same time and range. So as you're checking this, you kind of want to see, are you between 3.9 and 10 at any point during the day? And if it's above that, then maybe there's some medication adjustments that we would want to make. Now, of course, I think if you're in the 12-week program, we'd likely just say, well, let's just hang on, it'll come down.
Yeah.
But by and large, if you're not on insulin, not on sulfonylurea, you're on other diabetes medications, then, I generally like you to check your fasting glucose maybe 2 or 3 times a week. And then kind of as you're interested, check it around meals. If you're pre-diabetic, I don't think you need to do very much of that, right? Because really, the pre-diabetic state, your pancreas is still compensating pretty well for that insulin resistance. It's not the blood sugars per se that we're really worried about. So I don't think that you need to check it with the finger prick. The continuous glucose monitor can definitely be helpful here, because it'll show you which meals you totally do, your pancreas is really not keeping up with, because you'll spike on those meals. So it's worthwhile to do that. But even there, you don't need to do it all the time. So long and short of it is, the big reason to measure is if you're worried about lows. Otherwise, you're just kind of looking for patterns, looking for information that you can act upon. And so more data isn't always better, right? Because, you kind of know what you need to do. I think the CGMs are, awesome to do a 2-week cycle of them, make a bunch of changes, then keep focusing on those changes, come back a couple months later, do another 2-week cycle. It can be really helpful as well.
For sure. Okay. All right. Next question. How does Jardiance work?
Yeah, so Jardiance is what we call SGLT2 inhibitor, so sodium glucose transporter 2 inhibitor. So it works on the kidney. And the way to think about it is, when your body's creating urine, it actually lets all the glucose out. The body's kind of interesting. It's kind of a funny filter, right? It actually lets everything out and then it pulls back in the good stuff, right?
Interesting.
And so basically you've got this transporter that transports the glucose back into from the urine back into the bloodstream. And our bodies are really good at this. Like we our sugars have to be pretty high for us to spill over the capability of our body to reabsorb. And in fact, one of the things that's kind of strange with type 2 diabetes is you get better at reabsorbing glucose in diabetes than you do if you didn't.
Interesting.
Right. So you think like that would maybe one of nature's kind of little pressure valve, safety valve things, right?
Yeah.
Beyond a certain point, it's like, holy smokes, let's just pee it out.
Yeah.
You don't. So you actually get better. The actual SGLT2 protein, you start making more of it. So you start having higher capabilities. So anyways, the SGLT2 inhibitors basically make that transporter not work. So you just pee out some glucose. And you end up essentially peeing out a couple hundred calories of glucose a day. And so you're just peeing glucose. And so it really helps from a blood sugar standpoint. It helps a little bit from a weight perspective, because there's that little bit of a calorie kind of deficit. What is fascinating with that, and there's a post in the community about this, that deficit, you can actually kind of figure out what it should be, and you can calculate how much weight loss you should see from this if a calorie was just a calorie and there was no compensation.
Interesting. Yeah.
You actually can see that the weight loss is about 40% of the number that you would expect, and it's really on the basis that your brain does all these other things, and
Yeah.
so you compensate for it. So yeah, essentially that's how Jardiance works. Now, Jardiance has a whole bunch of really positive effects in terms of cardiovascular risk, and we don't fully understand it all. It's not purely on the
Okay.
basis of blood sugar control. So sometimes you'll find, if you're on Jardiance, and I've had this with a few patients recently who done really well. Their blood sugar's down. We're kind of at the place where we kind of want to stop the Jardiance, but their cardiologist wants to keep it because of the heart benefits.
Interesting.
And that's one I just don't think, I've been thinking about it for a while because obviously kind of in our program, most people want to stop medications because they don't really want to be on the medication. From a blood sugar perspective, we get to the place where we can say, yeah, you don't need it from your blood sugar. And then the question becomes, well, would there be another advantage to taking this medication? And definitely if somebody has had heart disease and the cardiologist really wants to keep it, when we're generally kind of, going to be supportive and in agreement with that. The one thing though that I do feel strongly is if you're having a lot of side effects from any of these medications, then that's more reason to probably, stop them regardless. Because, it doesn't really make sense to take a medication that's giving you side effects in order to prevent something that may happen in the future.
Yeah.
Probably better to find something now that works with you without side effect, that has some of those same kind of protective benefits. And usually we can find something. Jardiance, because you're peeing out glucose, the side effects are all related to, well, what happens when you have glucose in your urine? Well, what happens is things like to grow on glucose because they like to eat it. So, bacterial infections are more common, and yeast infections. And so the biggest limiting factor that people have with Jardiance is that they start getting yeast infections or bladder infections, and it just, drives them crazy, and they just don't want to take it anymore. So if you're on Jardiance and you're not having any of those side effects, then that's awesome. If you are on Jardiance and having those side effects, then that sometimes ends up being a reason for stopping it.
Cool. Okay. All right. So these two questions are somewhat related, and we like getting these a lot. So two things about, does this break my fast? So first one, diet soda.
Why are you drinking diet soda? So no, diet soda doesn't break your fast, but we don't really like the diet soda because of the sweeteners. And so the sweeteners, depending on the sweetener, can have some bad effects on your gut microbiome. So we don't like that part of it. But probably more significantly, they just leave your taste buds tuned for sweetness. Yeah. And so you tend to end up eating more sugar or having a harder time getting rid of kind of sugary things if you're drinking sweet stuff like diet soda. So, I would say, don't worry about it from the fasting perspective. Better means maybe a smaller portion, maybe switch over to carbonated water, something to get away from that.
Okay. And the other one is psyllium husk. Does that break your fast?
No. So psyllium husk is just fiber. Fiber is not absorbed. So things that break your fast are things with carbohydrate or protein in it. You notice I didn't say fat, right? Actually, having fat doesn't break your fast, because what we're worried about with breaking your fast is flipping out of fat burning. And so if you have more fat, you can burn it. But what's the point of burning somebody else's fat? You want to burn your own fat.
Yeah. That's why you hear the stories of people putting butter in their coffee, right? Because that's fat. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think that would taste very good. Okay. Next one. It's been suggested by my doctor that I start on a probiotic. Any recommendations?
Yeah, this is one where I wish there was more specificity that we could give to you. Bottom line is not really. So, there's some measures around quality, and generally speaking, if you, most of the places selling probiotics they'll have a variety of probiotics, and you can kind of talk to the person about what's the difference. But we just don't we don't have enough specificity as to the strain. So you're just trying to pick, is this a reputable vendor of probiotics? Like,
Mm.
and once you get that recommendation that yes, this is a good brand to buy, then by and large, it's a bit of trial and error in terms of so you'll see them kind of there'll be men's health and women's health and gut health and all these things. I just don't know that there's enough evidence to really say that these strains are going to have particular effects. So I do like the fact kind of suggested by a doctor. I even like better suggested by the dietitian. Often when people need a probiotic, I really prefer that they work with a dietitian one-on-one because often there's other things that will get rid of the digestive symptoms. And so the probiotic might be part of the picture, but there might be a lot of other things that can be done. And a dietitian can really kind of walk you through that, kind of give you that personalized help to get through that. I don't think you need to take probiotics just for the sake of gut health, kind of use nature's, or not nature's, but kind of food probiotics called fermented foods. That's probably a better way to go. But if you do get a recommendation that you should start a probiotic, and you can't work with a dietitian, then, pick a high quality probiotic, use it for about 2 months, see how you feel, see if there's any, if you notice a difference. And then after about 2 months, I think there's some value to changing to another brand of probiotic that's high quality. Probiotics, a lot of people think they, or kind of have the perception that, it's good bacteria in this little capsule. So if I'm taking it, it's going to seed my microbiome with all this good bacteria. And after a while, I don't need to take it because I'll have kind of planted my own seeds. It doesn't really work that way. The probiotics go right through you. But what happens is as they go through you, they change the ecosystem a little bit. And so their presence encourages some good bacteria and discourages some bad bacteria. And so that's helpful. What we're hoping is that as you do that, you kind of reestablish kind of all your good bacteria and you only need to take it for a period of time. But, I usually find that it's probably a couple of months that you should take it. And then if things have resolved, then you can kind of stop it. If they're, stop and you kind of feel like there's something, try another type of probiotic and gradually try to encourage your gut health that way. But I really wish there was more specificity that I could tell you exactly kind of what strains did what, but we don't quite know that yet.
For sure. Okay. And then almost at the end here, curious as to why the celery glycemic load is increased with cooking. It says it's 35 when raw, but 85 when cooked.
Yeah. So first of all, this is glycemic index, not glycemic load. And so this is a really common kind of, we get these things, confused, or we use one when we mean the other. So glycemic, index is really just kind of, how carby is the carb, how much like sugar is the carb. And so it kind of makes sense that when it's raw and it's attached to all the fiber, that it's gonna get absorbed less quickly than if it's cooked and basically the fiber is broken down a little bit. You're more likely to absorb it. You can kind of think the same thing, like take some berries and eat the berries just raw, and then take those same berries and kind of put them into a little heating pot and heat them up and turn them into kind of like a syrup. One's tastes way sweeter than the other. It's just you've kind of broken down the fiber component. But the reason I kind of drew the distinction why it's glycemic index is versus load. So load is how much carb is there actually there. In celery, there's not very much carbohydrate. So whether it's raw or cooked, at the end of the day, there's still not very much carbohydrate. So you really don't have to worry about it. So if you're having I think the only thing I ever have cooked celery in is a chowder, right? So when I'm having my chowder, I'm not really worried about the celery, the glycemic index of that celery has gone way up because there's still hardly any carb there. It's just like with watermelon. We say, watermelon's super high glycemic index, but there's not a lot of carb there, so the glycemic load is pretty low.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Okay, and the last question here, I think actually I can answer this one. This person says their CGM sensor got snagged and ripped off their arm by accident and only had it on for 2.5 days. Is it possible to get another one and maybe some kind of cover so it's protected in the future? So it is usually possible to get another one. If it came off really early in the 14 days, you can usually call Abbott's support line. If you just Google Freestyle Libre 2 support Abbott, you give them a call. They're usually pretty good about sending you out a replacement if it failed or fell off really early. They don't want us to promise anything. It's a case-by-case basis, but I would say give them a call and see what they can do. And then also there is this product you can buy at your pharmacy called Skin Tack. It basically looks like an alcohol swab, but it makes your skin sticky. And we found that does help them stay on a bit longer than just putting them on by themselves. So if you want to try that for the next one, you can do that as well. Okay. That's all the time we had for questions today. So thank you to everyone who sent their questions in, and send them in again for next time, and we will go through them all. So thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Make sure you share it with others who you think might benefit. And if you're interested in the Lifestyle RX program, of course, visit lifestyrx.ca to learn more. Thanks so much, Brendan, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks, Dan.
Bye-bye.